So it has been a few days since police in Memphis released videos that showed officers brutally beating 29-year-old Tyre Nichols, who later died from his injuries. I'm sure many of you have already seen the horrific videos, and we here are choosing not to show video of the attack. Over the weekend, the Memphis Police Department disbanded the specialized force that all 5 of the officers involved in the beating belonged to. It's known as the Scorpion Unit. Those officers now face second-degree murder charges, among others. One of the other things we saw in the video was EMTs and other officers who did not offer aid to Nichols for more than 10 minutes until finally an ambulance arrives 22 minutes after the beating. So let's start with talking about the videos. Erica, did you watch them or did you decide not to?
I didn't watch them, and I have no intention of watching them. I went the transcript route because obviously I have a job to do here and we need to know what's happening and the stories that we're talking about. I think about when we were the most, and I'll say immersed, because it's not as though brutality against Black bodies is new in this country at all. It's actually a part of the fabric of this country. But when I think about when we watched George Floyd, and we all watched it, and I thought in that moment there was this feeling that if we all bear witness collectively and diversely, that people will begin to understand the ingrained racism, the ingrained degradation of Black bodies and Black lives, that perhaps there would be calls to action that would result in the lives of the Tyre Nichols of the world being spared. And what we see, or what we read about, was that for 16 minutes there were first responders, EMTs, other officers on the scenes who did not intervene, which was very similar to the situation with George Floyd, where other people in positions of authority could have intervened at any point, which, by the way, makes them equally as culpable, in my opinion. So when we talk about the officer who doesn't look like the rest, the white officer who said, allegedly reportedly tased Tyre and also said, you need to stomp him. I question why his face isn't in that lineup, but I don't question it because I had that conversation on Friday when we talked about the idea of the color lines, that your Black is always going to be far more prominent than any blue. So if they thought that they were above the law and that they were protected, they now have the answer to that question as well.
Yeah, and for that same reason, you said it so eloquently, and I'll kind of talk after we're done with our interview, but I did not watch it as well for a lot of those reasons. I know how a lot of Black folks are looked at, especially by people in law enforcement, not all law enforcement, but the inhumane treatment it's a thing, it's a trend. It is part of the interactions daily that go on. So I don't need to see in graphic detail what that looks like played out. Like Erica said, we can just read about it and then form our own opinion.
Wow, here we are again. Okay, so for more on this, we are joined by former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney Bernarda Villalona. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us despite these horrible circumstances.
Yes, we appreciate you being here. Let's talk about the 5 officers facing charges. What's next for them, and if they're found guilty, how much time could they get in prison?
Yeah, so as of now, the 5 officers that have been charged, they've been charged with the top charge, state charge of murder in the second degree. So that's the knowing killing of another individual. If they are convicted, they can face anywhere from 15 years minimum up to 60 years. And that's in addition to the other charges: aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, official misconduct. There's also another charge of official misconduct. So that's just the state charges. But they can also face possible federal charges. And if they face federal charges. Those federal charges, now we're talking about a completely different exposure, because we're talking about acting under a color of law and depriving Mr. Tyre Nichols of his civil rights. And we're talking about up to a sentence of life, and that can be consecutive to the state sentences. We're dealing with two different jurisdictions. The administrative charges, we already dealt with that. They were terminated as a result of breaking administrative charges within the police department. So as you can see, their exposure is very large, but in the end, they took away the life of another human being while they were acting as a police officer.
Well, Counsel, I want to thank you for being here with us. I think I speak for our audience, and your guidance and wisdom is really appreciated. Now, we're talking about the police a lot, but do you think we're going to see charges against the medics and others that Erica stated were just standing around for more than 10 minutes before they got around to helping him?
So in terms of charges for the EMTs, as well as the sheriffs, as well as that white police officer, and I believe his name is Mr. Preston Hemphill, I foresee administrative charges. And when we're talking about administrative charges, we're talking about, as you're working in law enforcement, there are certain processes and procedures and laws that you have to abide by. And being that they disobeyed, being that they violated their duties in the sense of rendering aid, of intervening, that Officer Hemphill, how he said, I hope they stomp his ass, and also tase unnecessarily Mr. Nichols, I see that he, as well as others, can face disciplinary charges. Now, will it reach the level of criminal charges? I highly doubt that, because there are still a lot of questions in the sense of what did each of those individuals do? What did they see? What they did not do? So all those are questions that we have to think, can they be answered and proven in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt? When we're dealing with administrative charges, it's a different burden. It's a lesser burden. It's a more likely than not a preponderance of the evidence. And that's why administrative charges are so much easier to prove than criminal charges. But of course, administrative charges do not lead to a jail sentence.
Let's talk about this Scorpion unit that we mentioned earlier. It was just disbanded, right? Whenever I think of units inside a unit, I think it's like a all for one for all type of mentality. I think that's what we're seeing here. Should units like this even be able to be formed in the future?
So when we're talking about units as a Scorpion unit, look, they exist all around the country, just by a different name. Here in New York City, it used to be called the anti-crime unit. But if you ask people from the neighborhood that suffer from the bad acts of these units, call them the jump out boys, because they're the ones that are dressed in undercover clothing and regular civilian clothing. And if you've ever witnessed this, and unfortunately I have, is that all of a sudden you can be walking down the street and you see an unmarked car, all the doors open, and the officers, they jump out and just jump on someone or try to stop someone, and of course by not a nice measure. So anyway, in terms of those units, like I said, they exist all around the country. So while the Scorpion unit has been disbanded, is that the end to the problem? Because it's just going to be recreated under a different name with the same players, the same officers. Well, not these 5 officers, but the same officers that are on the force. The problem is much larger than that. It is a systemic problem. It is a cultural problem within law enforcement. And that's what needs to be dealt with at the root of it. How do you deal with that? I think what needs to happen is that the federal government, Department of Justice, needs to come in and do an investigation as to the patterns and practices of the Memphis Police Department. How did we get to the Scorpion unit? Are they other officers with the same mentality as those 5 officers that were involved in the death of Mr. Nichols? Take it a step further. People are praising that the Scorpion unit has been disbanded. They had no choice. Because for the prosecutor, it is a prosecution nightmare. Because just imagine all those arrests that they made now calls into question the validity of those past arrests and the credibility of those officers, even if they're not one of those 5 officers that were arrested. So it's going to be a nightmare for the prosecutor's office.
Wow. Well said, Bernarda. We thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insight. You can follow Bernarda at Villalona Law on Instagram. Thank you again. We appreciate you.
It's great.
Thank you.
Before we go to break, a lot of people have been talking about Tyre Nichols and the kind of man he was. He was a 29-year-old father to a 4-year-old son. He loved skateboarding and sunsets. His friends described him as a gentle, joyful, and lovable soul, someone who walked into a room and everyone loved him. He was the baby of his family who loved his mother. He even had her name tattooed on his arm. He said, or she calls him a beautiful soul who was honest, quirky, and true to himself. Now, a GoFundMe was set up by his mother. It has raised well over $1 million, and that money is going to build a memorial skate park in his honor, but it will not bring him back.
It won't, and you know, I appreciate the GoFundMe, and I hope it goes to good purposes, but I wonder if that's more for us to make ourselves feel better. Like, you know, hey, you know, we put some money towards this and everything's going to be all good. It's not all good. Sending $5 to that GoFundMe, yes, it is important, but the much harder work is talking about why we are continuing to do this same show, Jeff, Erica, and Sam, 6 years into DBL. It's the same. It's just another young life. I mean, just looking at him skateboard, I'm like, that is no longer on the planet anymore. That human being that was a part of our community is gone forever, and for what? We protect monsters in this country. We protect real life, horrendous people on a daily basis. People simp and go to bat for them every day online. And just a guy working at FedEx with great benefits, hanging out with his son and his mom is no longer here. So this is the society that we've created. And I don't think we should run from that or be able to be shielded from that with a couple of good measures on GoFundMe. I hope that we understand that we've created this. There's very few countries like this one, and we need to sit in this and understand that until we decide to have some real conversations that don't involve all caps on the internet, then we'll continue to do this story. So,
well said, man.